And this is the challenge. So if you draw a red line and then the other side violates that red line and you don't then retaliate, then the red line is worthless, which is why it's so risky to draw a red line. But that's what they did now that Houthis have violated it. And the coalition, this informal coalition, hasn't responded. And this is the challenge, really. They have to respond now, but it's very risky to respond because they are facing an armed conflict with the Houthis and, as a result, with Iran.
Now, the US Secretary of State has warned against further escalation in the Middle East and has renewed calls for further humanitarian aid in Gaza.
Too many Palestinian civilians are suffering from insufficient access to food, to water, to medicine, to other essential supplies. Children, most of all. We continue to raise with Israel the need to do everything possible to facilitate the provision of humanitarian aid to Gaza, and I will do so again when I'm there later this week.
That's Antony Blinken, who's been in Qatar as he continues his fourth trip to the Middle East since the October the 7th attacks. Israel says its major combat operations in northern Gaza are over and claims to have dismantled the Hamas military infrastructure there. I speak to Elisabeth Braw, a columnist for Foreign Policy magazine and a senior associate fellow at the European Leadership Network. Good morning, Elisabeth. I mean, in recent days, we've seen rocket attacks between Israel and Lebanese Hezbollah, plus there's obviously the situation in the Red Sea with Houthi rebels. Where would you say we are in terms of the risk of this conflict escalating further?
It's certainly escalating, and it's escalating in so many ways, or rather, there are more fronts now than there were 2 months ago, 1 month ago even. So more opportunities for somebody to miscalculate, or more risks that somebody will miscalculate, and that this will escalate beyond what people had planned. And this is really the risk in all this, that there are so many small fires that are burning, and that one fire can really take off and then get out of control.
And if you're Antony Blinken, what are you most concerned about? I mean, is it the potential for America to be dragged into a full-on regional conflict?
It certainly is that, but it's also this drip of attacks that are increasing in intensity and variety. And I think the most challenging part of this is the Red Sea situation, where it's not clear what, if anything, the US can do. What is the US Navy supposed to do about the Houthi attacks? Should it retaliate? Well, then it risks a war with or an armed conflict with the Houthis, and as a result, an armed conflict with Iran. Is it worth an armed conflict with Iran to protect global shipping? This is really the dilemma for the Americans, because they are the only the country, the force that can do something about this, about the Red Sea, but not even they are perfectly equipped to do much about the situation in the Red Sea, which is why it's continuing to deteriorate.
That's interesting. So it is continuing to deteriorate, because obviously last week we had that warning from the US and from the UK and from, I think, 10 other nations, basically saying to the Houthi rebels, look, cease your attacks on commercial shipping lanes, otherwise there will be consequences. But even despite that, have we seen the attacks continue?
Yes, that was a very clear statement that these governments, including the UK, put out, and it left no doubt that would be a price to pay if the Houthis continue their attacks. And yet they have continued their attacks, most recently on the 6th of January. And this is the challenge. So if you draw a red line and then the other side violates that red line and you don't then retaliate, then the red line is worthless, which is why it's so risky to draw a red line. But that's what they did now that Houthis have violated it. And the coalition, this informal coalition, hasn't responded. And this is the challenge, really. They have to respond now, but it's very risky to respond because they are facing an armed conflict with the Houthis and, as a result, with Iran. And we should remember that Iran now, on the 1st of January, sent a Navy frigate to the Red Sea. So essentially signaling that we are here too, and don't mess with the Houthis.
I mean, I don't mean to depress everyone, Elisabeth, at 5:43 in the morning, but I have heard speculation, and the worst case scenario for the West in 2024 is that you have Putin continuing his assault on targets in Ukraine. You have the West being drawn into a full-blown regional conflict in the Middle East, and then you have, and obviously we're a week off from the elections in Taiwan, China moving on Taiwan, and essentially the West being drawn into three fields of conflict. Do you think that is a realistic prospect?
It's certainly a prospect that we should take seriously. Now, when we look at Taiwan, I think one aspect to bear in mind is that the Chinese don't need to invade Taiwan for that to be a serious situation that the West somehow has to attend to or do something about, although it's not clear what the West could or should do. But if we think about, for example, what China can do without invading, for example, it can dispatch an inspection flotilla, which it has done in the past, essentially unilaterally decide that it will inspect all shipping going through the Taiwan Strait, including on Taiwan's side of the median line, then that is very provocative. It's also harmful to global shipping, and as a result, the global maritime order, and somebody should do something. Well, who is that somebody? Is it the West? And if the West does nothing, then China will conclude that it can continue to be provocative and to harass Taiwan.
Just finally, Elisabeth, Antony Blinken has also said that more needs to be done to protect Palestinian civilians, and he's endorsed the UN as a mediator, which some are saying is a bit of a snub to Israel. Is that how you see it?
It is. So the challenge really for the Biden administration is they said early on that their strategy with regards to Israel was to hug Israel close and essentially to completely support Israel, but with the opportunity that gave of being able to influence the Netanyahu government's decision-making. Now, the challenge for the Biden administration is that they haven't really been able to influence the Israeli government, and the Israeli government has even said, well, almost in so many words, we don't care what the US says, we have our own strategy. So it is a flawed strategy, I think. And now we are seeing Blinken and other representatives of the Biden administration beginning to be a bit more assertive vis-a-vis Israel. And that includes this potential, the suggestion of the UN potentially having a role. And it's something that I think the Biden administration wouldn't have suggested a few weeks ago, but they are essentially realizing it's their strategy of giving the Netanyahu government full support isn't really working, and they are not getting as many ideas through as they thought they would.
Elisabeth, really, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's Elisabeth Braw, columnist for Foreign Policy magazine and Senior Associate Fellow at the European Leadership Network.